Sometimes grief changes everything, and a man finds himself searching for something he can't even name. At 66, Buck Rawlins lost his wife, sold the ranch they'd built together, and bought an abandoned hotel in a forgotten ghost town, a place where the silence felt like the only mercy he had left. He wasn't looking to start over, just a quiet corner where regret couldn't follow him. But while clearing the dust-choked lobby, Buck discovered a hidden safe that hadn't been opened in nearly a century. Inside were love letters, photographs, and a story that mirrored his own broken heart. What secret had been buried in that hotel, and could it help Buck forgive himself? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The truck rattled over the last cattle guard, and Buck Rawlins eased his foot off the gas pedal. The road into Clemency Springs hadn't been maintained in decades, judging by the way sagebrush grew through cracks in the asphalt. In the trailer behind him, Gracie shifted her weight, and Buck heard the soft thud of her hooves against the rubber mat. He glanced in the side mirror and caught a glimpse of the donkey's long ears. "Grey and soft as velvet. Almost there, girl," he said. Though the window between them was closed, the town appeared gradually, the way forgotten places do. First a rusted road sign, then the skeletal frame of what might have been a gas station, and finally the buildings themselves, lined up along a main street that led nowhere. Buck counted maybe 20 structures, most of them listing to one side or the other, windows dark as empty eye sockets. The mountains rose behind them, purple in the late afternoon light, snow still clinging to the highest peaks, even though it was April. He'd seen this place once before, 60 years ago. His father had stopped here on a road trip, back when Buck was just 6 years old. They'd gotten lunch at a diner that no longer existed, and Buck remembered thinking the town seemed tired even then. Now it was dead. Population 0, according to the website where he'd found the listing. Ghost town. Historic mining settlement. Victorian-era architecture. Property available for purchase. The Fortuna Hotel stood at the end of Main Street, 3 stories of weathered brick and peeling white trim. Ivy had claimed the east wall, crawling up past the second-floor windows and reaching for the roof. Several windows were broken and the front porch sagged like an old man's spine. But the bones were good. Buck could see that even from here. The foundation looked solid, and the roofline, though missing shingles, maintained its original angle. He parked the truck in front and sat there for a moment, hands still on the wheel. The engine ticked as it cooled. Through the windshield, he could see the hotel's entrance, a pair of oak doors with frosted glass panels. One panel was cracked down the middle. Buck was 66 years old. He'd spent 40 years building a cattle ranch in eastern Montana with his wife, Martha. They'd raised 200 head, fixed their own fences, delivered calves in snowstorms, and fallen into bed exhausted every night of their marriage. It had been good work, honest work, the kind that left your hands scarred and your back sore but your conscience clear. Martha had died 6 months ago, lung cancer, though she'd never smoked a day in her life. The diagnosis came in January of last year, and by September, she was gone. Buck had held her hand in the hospital room and tried to find words that mattered, but everything he said sounded hollow. "I love you" seemed too small. "Thank you" seemed insufficient. In the end, he'd just held on and felt her slip away, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing he'd ever heard. He'd sold the ranch in February. Their son lived in Seattle, worked in computers, hadn't been home in 5 years. He'd offered to come back, help his father figure things out, but Buck had told him not to bother. What was there to figure out? The ranch without Martha was just land and cattle. He sold it to a young couple from Wyoming for a fair and price, and watched them drive off with everything he'd spent his life building. Loaded in the back of their trucks, the money sat in his bank. Account like an accusation. He'd tried staying in town, renting a small apartment above the feed store, but every morning he'd wake up and forget, just for a second, that Martha was gone. Then he'd remember, and the day would collapse under the weight of it. So he'd started driving. No destination, just movement. He'd driven through North Dakota and South Dakota, down into Nebraska, across into Colorado. Somewhere around the Wyoming border, he'd stopped at a diner for coffee and used the internet on his phone to search for something he couldn't quite name. Property for sale didn't feel right. Fresh start felt like a lie. Finally, he'd typed ghost town buildings and scrolled through listings until he found this one, the Fortuna Hotel, built 1926. 3 stories, 12 rooms, original Victorian architecture. Needs extensive renovation. Cash sale only. Price, $47,000. He'd stared at the photos for 20 minutes. The hotel looked like something from another century, which it was. The kind of place his father might have stayed in during those old road trips. Buck remembered being 6 years old, standing in a lobby somewhere, watching his father sign a guest register with a fountain pen. He'd bought the hotel on impulse. If you could call a $47,000 decision an impulse. The realtor had tried to talk him out of it, explaining that Clemency Springs had no power, no water, no services of any kind. The nearest town with a grocery store was 40 minutes away. But Buck had already made up his mind. He'd paid cash, signed the papers, and driven straight here with Gracie in the trailer, and everything else he owned stuffed into the truck bed. Now he climbed out and walked around to open the trailer gate. Gracie backed out carefully, her hooves clopping on the metal ramp. She was a standard grey donkey, 14 hands tall, with a white muzzle and dark dorsal stripe. Buck had bought her 15 years ago to guard the sheep they'd kept for a while. After the sheep were sold, Gracie had just stayed on, following Buck around the ranch like a faithful dog. When he'd sold the property, she was the one thing he'd insisted on keeping. "What do you think?" he asked her, gesturing at the hotel. Gracie flicked her ears forward and studied the building with dark, thoughtful eyes. Then she walked over to a patch of dried grass and started grazing. Buck grabbed his duffel bag from the truck and approached the front doors. The key the realtor had sent was old brass, heavy in his hand. It took some wiggling, but the lock finally turned, and the door swung inward with a groan that echoed through the empty building. The lobby was bigger than he'd expected. The ceiling rose 2 stories, with a balcony running along the 2nd floor. A chandelier hung from a central beam, so thick with dust and cobwebs that Buck couldn't tell what it was made of. The floor was tile, black and white in a checkerboard pattern, most of it cracked but still intact. To his right stood a check-in desk, dark wood with an ornate front panel. Behind it a wall of mail cubbies, each one empty except for dust and dead flies. The air smelled like rot and neglect, but underneath that was something else. Wood polish, old carpet, the faint ghost of cigar smoke. The hotel remembered what it used to be. Buck walked slowly through the space, his boots leaving tracks in the dust. To the left of the lobby was what had probably been a sitting room, now filled with broken furniture and fallen plaster. Straight ahead, a staircase climbed to the 2nd floor, its banister intact but listing slightly. Every surface was covered in grime, and bird droppings marked the floor beneath holes in the ceiling. He'd known it would be bad. The photos had shown as much. But standing here, feeling the weight of the damage, Buck wondered for the first time if he'd made a mistake. This wasn't a weekend project. This was months of work, maybe years. And for what? To live alone in a building too big for one man and a donkey? But then he remembered the alternative, the apartment above the feed store, waking up every morning to realize Martha was still gone, filling his days with nothing that mattered. At least here he'd have purpose. Fix the roof. Replace the windows. Clear out the debris. Simple work, the kind where progress could be measured in square feet of cleaned floor and boards replaced. Buck climbed the stairs carefully, testing each step before putting his weight on it. The 2nd floor was a hallway with 6 doors, 3 on each side. He opened them one by one. Most of the rooms were in terrible shape. Walls water-damaged, floors warped, furniture long since destroyed by weather and animals. But the last room on the right was better. The window was intact, and though the wallpaper was peeling, the structure seemed sound. The room held a metal bed frame, a small dresser, and a wooden chair. "This'll do," Buck said to himself. He went back to the truck and unloaded his sleeping bag. A Coleman stove, a lantern, and a cooler with 3 days' worth of food. He'd seen a hand pump out back that the realtor said sometimes worked. If he could get that going, he'd have water for washing. Drinking water he'd bring in from town. Gracie had wandered around to the back of the building where she'd found better grass. Buck set up his camp in the second-floor room, spreading the sleeping bag on the bed frame and arranging his supplies on the dresser. As the sun set, he lit the lantern and sat on the porch steps with a can of soup heated on the camp stove. The mountains turned gold, then purple, then black. Stars appeared, more than Buck had seen in years, even on the ranch. The silence was complete. No cars, no voices, no distant sounds of civilization. Just wind moving through empty buildings and the occasional call of a night bird. Buck thought about Martha. Specifically, he thought about a conversation they'd had 3 years ago. She'd wanted to take a vacation, rent a cabin somewhere, spend a week doing nothing but reading and walking and being together. But it had been calving season, and Buck had said no. There was always a reason to say no. Work, weather, timing. Now he had all the time in the world and no one to spend it with. He finished the soup and washed the can out with water from a jug. Gracie appeared from around the building, moving quietly in that way donkeys do, and stood near the porch. Buck reached out and scratched behind her ears, feeling the coarse hair and the warm skin beneath. "We'll make it work," he told her. "Fix it up just enough to matter." The worn leather saddle sat in the bed of his truck, covered with a tarp. It had been Martha's. She'd ridden horses when they first met, before the ranch took all their time. Buck hadn't been able to leave it behind, even though Gracie had never worn it and never would. It was tooled leather with silver conchos, darkened by years of use, and it smelled like saddle soap and the barn they used to have. Martha's saddle, another thing that should have a place and a purpose, but now just existed as a reminder of everything that was gone. Buck stood and stretched, feeling his back pop. 66 years old, sleeping on a metal bed frame in an abandoned hotel. If anyone from his old life could see him now, they'd think he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. But crazy or not, this felt right. Like he'd been pointed in this direction for a long time and had only just now arrived. He climbed the stairs to his room, pulled off his boots, and crawled into the sleeping bag. The building settled around him with creaks and groans. Somewhere far off, a coyote howled. Buck closed his eyes, and for the first time since Martha died, fell asleep without dreading the morning. Buck spent the first week just clearing the lobby. He worked methodically, the way he'd always worked, starting in one corner and moving across. He wore leather gloves and carried a contractor bag, filling it with broken glass, chunks of plaster, and things that had once been furniture but were now just splinters and dust. The check-in desk intrigued him. It was solid walnut, heavy as a coffin, with carved details along the front panel. Someone had built it to last, which it had. Buck swept the top clean and discovered names carved into the wood. Initials mostly. J.H. 1928. P&M 1927. Small acts of vandalism that were now historical record. Behind the desk, the wall was paneled in the same dark wood. Buck knocked on it as he cleaned, listening to the sound change from solid to hollow. Old buildings had their secrets, hollow walls where pipes used to run, false panels hiding electrical boxes that no longer existed. He'd learned that on the ranch, fixing up the old homestead that had come with the property. On the 8th day, while prying loose a section of damaged baseboard, Buck noticed something. A gap between two panels, barely visible, but there. He worked his fingers into the space and pulled. The panel came away with a crack of old glue, revealing a cavity in the wall about 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall. And there, set into the brick, was a safe. It was small, maybe 18 inches square, made of green-painted metal that was flaking with age. No combination lock, just a keyhole and a handle. Buck reached for it instinctively, then pulled back. He stood there for a moment, staring at it, feeling an odd sensation in his chest. This was someone's secret, someone's private thing, hidden away and forgotten. He went to the truck and retrieved his toolbox. The lock was old, and Buck had no key, but he had a pry bar and patience. He worked carefully, not wanting to damage whatever might be inside, levering the bar into the gap between the door and the frame. The metal groaned. He applied more pressure, and with a screech that echoed through the empty lobby, the lock gave way. The safe door swung open. Inside were papers, stacks of them yellowed with age, tied with string that crumbled when Buck touched it. He pulled everything out carefully and spread it across the cleaned section of the check-in desk. The papers were letters, written in careful longhand on stationery that had once been cream-colored but was now the color of old bone. Beneath the letters were photographs, black and white, some of them stuck together. And at the bottom, a ledger book with guest registry embossed on the cover in faded gold. Buck picked up the first letter. The paper felt fragile, like it might dissolve in his hands. The handwriting was masculine, neat and controlled. The date at the top read April 15, 1929. "My dearest Eliza," it began. Buck read slowly, his lips moving slightly with the words. "I write this, knowing you may never read it, and perhaps that's for the best. You ask me to choose, and I find I cannot. The hotel is failing, that much is true, but I built it with my own hands, and I cannot simply walk away. You say I'm choosing a building over you, and perhaps you're right. But it feels like more than that. It feels like choosing between the man I am and the man I wish to be. I think of you constantly. I imagine you in Denver, living the life you deserve, attending parties and gallery openings, surrounded by people who understand you in ways I never could. You belong there in civilization, not in this dying town, with a stubborn fool who doesn't know when to quit. The guests have stopped coming. The mines are closing one by one. I've let go of the staff, and now it's just me, cleaning rooms that no one rents, dusting furniture that no one sits on. But I cannot leave, not yet. Give me until winter. If I can make it through winter, perhaps I can make this work. Forgive me. I'm staying." The letter was signed simply Thomas. Buck read it twice, then set it down and picked up another. The date on this one was May 2nd, 1929. "Dearest Eliza, I received your letter. I understand your anger, though it wounds me. You say I'm wasting my life on a fantasy, and perhaps you're right. But what is a man without his work? Without something he's built and nurtured and made his own? I cannot answer that question, and so I stay." Another letter dated June 18th. "The bank has threatened foreclosure. I've sold everything I can sell. Still I stay." July 5th. "I dreamed of you last night. We were young again, before the hotel, before the arguments. I woke up and the dream was better than reality. Forgive me." August 13th. "I am tired, Eliza, so very tired." Buck looked up from the letters and stared at the wall. His heart was beating faster than it should be. These weren't just old documents. This was a man's life written in real time, falling apart one letter at a time. And the words, "Forgive me. I'm staying." Those words echoed something Buck couldn't quite name but felt deeply. He turned to the photographs. The first one showed a man and a woman standing in front of the hotel. The hotel looked new, the paint fresh, the windows clean. The man was in his 30s, dark-haired, with kind eyes and a slight smile. He wore a suit. The woman beside him was beautiful, dark hair pinned up, wearing a dress that came to her calves. Her hand rested on his arm, and even in the faded photograph, Buck could see the affection between them. He turned the photo over. Written on the back in the same handwriting from the letters, "Thomas and Eliza." June 1927, opening day. Buck set the photo down carefully and sat in the old desk chair, which creaked under his weight. The late afternoon sun slanted through the broken windows, illuminating the dust that hung in the air. Somewhere outside, Gracie brayed. He picked up another letter, but his hands were shaking slightly. He set it back down, Thomas and Eliza. A man who couldn't let go of what he'd built. A woman who wanted him to choose her instead. Buck knew this story. He'd lived a version of it. How many times had Martha asked him to take a break, go on vacation, spend time that wasn't about cattle and fences and hay? And how many times had he said no, always with a good reason, always with work that needed doing? The difference was that Martha had stayed. She'd stopped asking eventually, and they'd built their life around the ranch's demands. But what if she hadn't? What if she'd given him an ultimatum, the way Eliza apparently had? Buck realized he was thinking about Martha in the past tense, which was accurate, but still felt like betrayal. 6 months. It had only been 6 months. Sometimes when he first woke up, he'd forget and think she was downstairs making coffee or out feeding the chickens they used to keep. Then he'd remember, and the day would start with that small death all over again. He stood abruptly and walked to the window. The street outside was empty, of course. Empty buildings and empty road and mountains in the distance. He'd come here looking for silence, and he'd found it. But now he'd also found this. Thomas's hidden heartbreak, sealed in a safe for nearly a century. Buck turned back to the desk and methodically gathered all the letters. He counted them, 47 in total, spanning from April 1929 to December 1929. He stacked them carefully, then examined the photographs. There were 6, Thomas and Eliza at the opening, Thomas alone behind the check-in desk, the hotel's dining room full of guests, Eliza sitting in what looked like a garden, Thomas and another man standing by a car, and one more of Eliza a close-up. Her face turned slightly away from the camera. The guest registry was last. Buck opened it carefully. The pages were thick, designed to last, and the entries began in 1926. Neat rows of names, dates, room numbers. Comments from guests. Wonderful stay. Excellent service. Will return. The handwriting was Thomas's. Buck recognized it now from the letters. The entries continued through 1927 and 1928. Then, starting in early 1929, they became sparse. Whole weeks with no entries. Months, finally, with just 1 or 2 names. The last entry was dated December 15th, 1929. J. Morrison, room 3, passing through. Below that, Thomas had written something else. Not an entry, but a note. Final month. Bank takes possession March 1st. God help me. Buck closed the registry and sat back. The sun had moved, and the lobby was dim now, shadows gathering in the corners. He lit his lantern and spread the letters across the desk again, arranging them chronologically. He would read them all, he decided. Every single one. He would piece together what had happened here, why Thomas had stayed, what became of Eliza. It was the first thing Buck had cared about, really cared about, since Martha died. That should have worried him, maybe, getting obsessed with a century-old tragedy instead of dealing with his own. But it didn't. It felt like a door opening, like finding something worth doing in the middle of all this silence. He picked up the next letter and began to read as the last light faded from the sky. Buck woke at dawn, with the letters still on his mind. He'd read until midnight, working through the stack by lantern light, and each one had deepened the story. Thomas wasn't just a stubborn businessman. He was a man watching his dream die in real time, documenting his own failure with painful honesty. After a breakfast of instant coffee and oatmeal, Buck spread the contents of the safe across the lobby floor, organizing them methodically. He arranged the letters by date, creating a timeline. He studied the photographs more carefully, holding them up to the morning light that streamed through the broken windows. The photograph of Thomas and Eliza from opening day, June 1927, showed them standing in front of the hotel's entrance. The building behind them was pristine. Fresh paint, clean windows, flower boxes on the porch railing. Thomas wore a dark suit and tie, his expression proud but humble. Eliza wore a cream-colored dress with lace at the collar, her dark hair styled in the fashion of the 20s. But it was their body language that struck Buck most. Eliza's hand rested on Thomas's arm, her fingers curled around his sleeve. Thomas leaned slightly toward her, not quite touching but close. They looked like two people who belonged together. Buck turned the photo over again, studying Thomas's handwriting. Opening day. The pride in those 2 words was evident even 98 years later. He picked up another photograph, Thomas alone behind the check-in desk. Probably taken in 1928. Thomas looked older here, tired. His suit was the same, but it hung differently on him, like he'd lost weight. His smile seemed forced. Buck thought about the early letters, the ones from 1927 that he'd found deeper in the stack. Those had been different, full of hope and plans. Thomas writing to Eliza about their future, about the hotel becoming a destination, about building something that would last. "We'll fill every room," one letter had promised. We'll make this the finest hotel between Denver and Salt Lake. But by April 1929, when the hidden letters began, the tone had changed completely. Those early hopeful letters must have been sent. These later ones, the ones in the safe, were the ones Thomas had written but couldn't bring himself to mail. The ones that admitted failure. Buck spent the morning creating a more detailed timeline, writing notes in a small notebook he'd found in his truck. He listed key dates. Hotel opens June 1926. Business thrives through 1927. First signs of trouble early 1928. Mining operations begin closing. Guests stop coming. Thomas fires staff. Eliza gives ultimatum sometime in early 1929. Thomas starts writing letters he won't send. Around noon, Buck heard a vehicle approaching. He stood from where he'd been kneeling on the lobby floor and walked to the porch. A faded blue pickup truck pulled up, and an elderly woman climbed out slowly. She was small, thin, with white hair pulled back in a bun. She wore jeans and a flannel shirt and moved with the careful deliberation of someone past 70. "You the fellow who bought the Fortuna?" She called out. "That's right. Buck Rawlins." He walked down the steps and extended his hand. She shook it firmly. "Vera Hayes. I live about 5 miles east of here. Last resident of Clemency Springs, I suppose, though my place is technically outside town limits." She looked up at the hotel, shading her eyes. "Haven't been inside this building in 40 years. Looks like you've got your work cut out for you." "Yes, ma'am. Brought you some supplies. Figured you might not have had a chance to get to town yet." She walked to her truck bed and pulled out a cardboard box. Buck took it from her. It was heavier than it looked. Inside were canned goods, bread, eggs, coffee, and what looked like homemade cookies wrapped in wax paper. "That's very kind of you," Buck said. "You didn't have to do that. Town's been empty for 30 years. When I heard someone bought the hotel, I figured I'd better come introduce myself before you thought you were completely alone out here." She looked at him directly, her eyes sharp. "You are aware there's no power, no water, no services?" "I am. And you bought it anyway?" "I did." Vera studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Well, you're either crazy or looking for something. In my experience, it's usually both." She glanced at Gracie, who was watching them from around the corner of the building. "That's your donkey?" "Yes, ma'am. Her name's Gracie. Good company, donkeys. Better than most people." Vera looked back at the hotel. "My grandmother used to tell stories about this place. Said it was the finest hotel in 3 counties back in the 20s. All the important people stayed here when they came through." Buck felt something tighten in his chest. "Your grandmother knew the hotel?" "She grew up in Clemency Springs, left in the 30s, but she always talked about the old days." Vera paused. "Said the owner was a good man. Worked himself to death trying to keep it open when the mines closed. Tragic story, the way she told it. The owner's name was Thomas," Buck said. "Thomas Fortuna." Vera's eyebrows rose. "You've been doing research?" "I found some things, letters, photographs." Buck hesitated, then decided. "Would you like to see them?" They went inside, and Buck showed Vera what he'd found. She put on reading glasses and examined the photographs carefully, handling them with the reverence they deserved. When she picked up the photograph of Thomas and Eliza, she was quiet for a long moment. "Grandmother mentioned them," she finally said. "Thomas and Eliza. Said they were engaged but never married. Something happened." She looked at Buck. "What do the letters say?" Buck gave her a summary. The failing business, Eliza in Denver, Thomas unable to let go of the hotel. Vera listened, nodding slowly. "That matches what grandmother said. She told me Eliza wanted Thomas to give up the hotel and move to Denver with her. Start fresh somewhere else. But he wouldn't leave." Vera set down the photograph. "Pride," grandmother said. "Thomas had too much pride to walk away from what he'd built, even when it was clearly failing." Buck felt that observation like a physical thing. Pride. That was one word for it. Stubbornness was another. He thought about the ranch, about all the times Martha had suggested they sell, move somewhere easier, maybe closer to their son. Buck had always said no. The ranch was their legacy, their life's work. How could they just walk away? Except they had walked away eventually. Or rather, Buck had, after Martha was gone, and the ranch was just land and cattle with no one to share it with. "Do you know what happened to them?" Buck asked. Thomas and Eliza? Vera shook her head. Grandmother left town in 1933. By then the hotel had been closed for years. She never knew what became of Thomas. Assumed he drifted off like so many others after the mines shut down. She paused. Why does it matter to you? Buck looked at the letters spread across the floor, at the photograph of two people who'd looked happy once. I'm not sure, he said honestly. But it does. Vera stayed for another hour, helping Buck continue organizing the letters. She pointed out details he'd missed, mentions of specific mines, references to people who'd been prominent in the area. She had a historian's mind, able to place the letters in context. Before she left, she turned to Buck on the porch. You be careful with this, she said, gesturing back toward the hotel. It's easy to disappear into other people's tragedies when you're avoiding your own. Buck felt seen in a way that made him uncomfortable. I'm just fixing up an old building. If you say so. Vera climbed into her truck, then leaned out the window. I'll come by again next week. Bring more supplies. Meanwhile, don't be a stranger. My place is 5 miles east on the main road. Can't miss it. Only house with lights on for 30 miles. Buck watched her drive away, dust rising behind her truck. Then he went back inside, sat down in front of the letters, and continued reading Thomas's confession of failure. One page at a time, Buck spent the next several days working his way through the guest registry while simultaneously tackling the hotel's second floor. He'd carry the ledger with him, setting it on windowsills or upended furniture while he worked, reading entries during breaks. The registry told a story as clear as the letters, maybe clearer. In 1926 and 1927, nearly every page was full. Names from all over, California, Kansas, New York. Traveling salesmen were the most frequent guests. Their entries marked with company names, representing Sears, hardware sales, pharmaceuticals. But there were also families passing through. Prospectors headed to the mines and what Thomas had noted as tourists seeking mountain air. The comments were effusive. Excellent accommodations. Mrs. Fortuna's cooking was superb. We'll recommend to colleagues. That last bit caught Buck's attention. Mrs. Fortuna. Thomas had been married then, at least for a while. Buck flipped back through the letters, looking for any mention of a wife, but found none. Only Eliza. The pattern continued through 1927, pages full of names, consistent business, Thomas's pride evident in his neat notations. Then came 1928. The first indication of trouble was subtle. Entries became less frequent. A week in March with only 2 guests. Thomas had written in the margin, Cassidy Mine closed. Expect fewer travelers. By summer, the gaps widened. 10 days with no guests. 2 weeks. Thomas's margin notes became more desperate. Must reduce prices. Need to advertise in Denver papers. Coal mine announcing layoffs. Buck sat on the floor of what had been room 7, the registry open on his lap, and did the math. If the hotel had 12 rooms and was operating at near capacity for 2 years, Thomas had been doing well. But mining towns lived and died by their mines. When the ore ran out or prices dropped, everything else followed. Businesses closed, workers left, and a hotel with no guests was just an expensive building. He thought about his own ranch. 40 years of work. But if cattle prices had collapsed, if drought had hit for multiple seasons, if any of a dozen variables had gone wrong, he and Martha would have been in the same situation as Thomas. The difference was luck and timing. Thomas had none of either. Buck used his phone to search for mining collapse 1928 Colorado. Several articles came up, mostly from historical websites. He learned that the late 1920s had seen a wave of mine closures in small western towns. Where prices dropped, seams played out, and operations that had seemed permanent vanished in months. Clemency Springs had hosted 3 mines, according to one article. All 3 had closed between 1927 and 1929. Thomas hadn't failed due to incompetence or poor management. He'd failed because the entire economic basis of his town had evaporated. The hotel was collateral damage. Buck returned to the letters, reading them now with this context. June 1928. Eliza, my dearest, I know you want me to give this up, but I've invested everything we have. If I can just weather this downturn, when the economy recovers, the hotel will be here. November 1928. You say the hotel is not worth losing us over. You're right, of course. But I cannot see the path forward that doesn't involve abandoning everything I've worked for. One letter, dated late November 1928, had been particularly hard to read. You asked if I loved the hotel more than I loved you. The question itself breaks my heart. I don't love the hotel. I love what it represents. That I built something, that I mattered, that I didn't just drift through life leaving nothing behind. Without this, what am I? A failed businessman with empty pockets and broken promises. Give me time, please. Buck set the letter down and stared at the water-stained ceiling. He remembered a specific fight with Martha maybe 10 years ago. She'd wanted to visit their son in Seattle, spend 2 weeks there, maybe see some of the country on the way. But it was haying season, and Buck couldn't leave. They'd needed every day of good weather to get the hay in. Martha had been angry, more angry than he'd seen her in years. The hay will wait, she'd said. It's always waited. But I won't wait forever. She had waited, though. She'd stayed, stopped asking for trips, settled into the rhythm of the ranch. Buck had thought that meant she'd accepted it, that she understood the work had to come first sometimes. Now, reading Thomas's words, he wondered if Martha had just given up. If she'd stopped asking because she knew the answer would always be no. The registry's final entries told the end of the story. December 1928, 5 guests total. January 1929, 3 guests. February 2. By spring of 1929, weeks passed with no entries at all. Then in December 1929, that final entry, J. Morrison, room 3, passing through. Below it, Thomas's handwritten note, final month. Bank takes possession March 1st. God help me. Buck closed the registry and stood, his knees protesting. He was spending too much time sitting on floors, reading old papers. He needed to get back to actual work. But the pull of the story was strong. He wanted to know what happened next. Did Thomas leave before the bank took the hotel? Did he try to find Eliza? Did he ever forgive himself? That evening, Buck made himself work on practical matters. He patched several broken windows with plywood, knowing he'd need to order actual glass eventually. He fixed the hand pump in back, which took 2 hours and resulted in rusty water, but water nonetheless. He cleared 2 more rooms on the 2nd floor and repaired a section of porch railing that had rotted through. As the sun set, he sat on the porch steps with Gracie beside him. She'd been good company, never demanding, just present. Buck scratched behind her ears and watched the mountains turn purple. Martha wanted me to take time off, he said to the donkey. Every year she'd bring it up. Every year I'd have a reason why we couldn't. The cattle needed moving. The fence needed fixing. The hay needed baling. Always something. Gracie's ear flicked toward him, but she didn't move otherwise. I thought I was being responsible. Keeping the ranch running, providing for us, Buck paused. Maybe I was just being like Thomas. Too proud to admit when it was time to let go. Too stubborn to choose the person over the place. The difference, Buck knew, was that Martha had never left. She'd stayed until cancer took her, and Buck had never had to choose. But he'd made the choice anyway, hadn't he? Every time he'd said no to a vacation, no to a visit with their son, no to a weekend away. He'd chosen the ranch over her, over and over, and she'd let him. Maybe that was worse. Buck stood and went inside to his camping setup. He lit the lantern and pulled out the photograph of Thomas and Eliza from opening day. They looked so happy, so certain of their future. He wondered if Thomas had any idea, standing there in his suit with Eliza's hand on his arm, how quickly it would all fall apart. Probably not. No one ever does. He set the photograph on the dresser, propped against the wall where he could see it. Then he lay down in his sleeping bag and stared at the ceiling, thinking about choices made and chances lost, until sleep finally came. 3 weeks into his stay at the Fortuna, Buck was cleaning out the hotel office when he found the telegram. The office was a small room behind the check-in desk, and it had taken him days just to clear a path through the debris. Filing cabinets had rusted shut, and old ledgers were scattered across a desk that had collapsed on one side. He was sorting through papers, most of them too damaged to read, when he found a telegram folded inside the guest registry. It had been used as a bookmark, apparently, marking a page from October 1929. The telegram was brief, as they always were. Urgent, stock market collapse, stop. Black Tuesday, Oct 29, stop. Losses catastrophic, stop. Banks restricting withdrawals, stop. Buck sat back on his heels. He knew about Black Tuesday, of course. The stock market crash that triggered the Great Depression. But seeing the actual telegram delivered to this remote hotel made it real in a way history books never had. Thomas would have received this and known immediately that whatever slim chance he'd had of saving the hotel was gone. Buck pulled out his phone and searched for more information. October 29th, 1929. Investors lost billions. Banks began failing within weeks. Credit disappeared. The economy spiraled into the worst depression in American history. He looked at the telegram again, then at the registry page it had marked. Late October 1929. The entries showed 2 guests that week, 2, and after October 29th, there were no more entries until that final one in December. Buck returned to the letters. Looking for ones dated after October 29th, there were only 3. The first, dated November 5th, 1929. Dearest Eliza, I'm sure you've heard about the market crash. Everything I've saved, everything I'd hoped might carry us through is gone. The bank in Denver, where I kept our reserves, has closed. I cannot pay my debts. I cannot make the mortgage payment. I am, in every sense, ruined. I do not write to ask for your forgiveness or understanding. I write only to release you from any obligation you may have felt toward me. You deserve better than a failed man with an empty hotel and empty pockets. Please build a good life. Find someone worthy of you. Forget me. The second letter, dated November 20th. Eliza, I've been thinking about what I would say if I could see you one more time. I would apologize for being too proud to see what mattered. I would tell you that every day I stayed here was a day I regretted not being with you. I would say that you were right. The hotel isn't worth losing us over. But I cannot say these things because I've lost you already. I stayed and you left, and now all I have are letters I'll never send to a woman who deserves better than these hollow words. The third and final letter, dated December 10th, 1929. My darling Eliza, this will be the last letter I write to you. The bank forecloses in March. I'll be gone before then. I cannot bear to watch strangers take what I built. I don't know where I'll go. West, perhaps. Somewhere I can start over with nothing, which is what I have. I hope you're well. I hope you've forgotten me. I hope you're happy. I loved you more than I knew how to show, and that failure is mine alone. Forgive me. I'm staying until I can't anymore. Buck read all 3 letters twice, sitting on the dusty office floor with weak afternoon sunlight filtering through the grimy window. The tragedy was complete now. Thomas hadn't just failed, he'd been crushed by forces beyond his control. The hotel failing was bad enough, but losing everything to a stock market crash while already on the brink must have been devastating. He thought about his own life, about how much of success or failure came down to luck. If Martha's cancer had come 10 years earlier, when they were still building the ranch, would they have had the money for treatments? If cattle prices had crashed during those lean years in the 90s, would he have lost the ranch the way Thomas lost the hotel? Buck stood and walked to the window. Gracie was visible outside, standing in the shade of the building. Beyond her, the ghost town stretched away, empty buildings marking the graves of other failed dreams. Clemency Springs had been a thriving community once. 3 mines, a hotel, shops, families. Now it was just abandoned structures and silence, but here was the thing Buck kept circling back to. Martha hadn't left. Through lean years and hard times, through arguments about taking time off and disagreements about the future, she'd stayed. She'd made the choice Thomas had wanted Eliza to make. She'd chosen the person and the place together, even when it cost her. And what had Buck done with that gift? He'd worked. He'd built the ranch into something successful. He'd provided a good life. But had he appreciated it? Had he appreciated her? Or had he taken her presence for granted the way Thomas had taken Eliza's for granted, assuming she'd always be there? Buck left the office and went outside. The afternoon was warm, and he needed to do something physical. He'd been spending too much time in his head, too much time reading letters and thinking about the past. He got tools from his truck and started working on the porch, replacing rotten boards with new lumber he'd bought on his last supply run. The work was good, repetitive, mindful, requiring just enough attention that he couldn't drift into heavy thoughts. Measure, cut, fit, nail, one board at a time. He worked for 3 hours, replacing a dozen boards, and the porch began to look like something that could actually support weight. Vera drove up as Buck was finishing. She climbed out with another box of supplies. "Porch is looking good," she said, studying his work. "Getting there. Still got the railing to fix and the whole thing needs paint, but it's solid now." Vera set the box down and looked at him carefully. "You've been thinking hard about something. I can see it on your face." Buck hammered in a final nail before answering. "Found more information about Thomas. The stock market crash happened right when he was already failing. Lost everything." "That must have been hard to read." It was. Buck set down his hammer. "Makes me think about my own choices. My wife, Martha, she wanted to take vacations, spend time away from the ranch. I always said no. Too much work, too much responsibility." "Did she leave you over it?" "No, she stayed. That's what gets me. She stayed, and I just kept choosing work over her, over and over." Vera was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You can't change what's done. You can only decide what you do with what's left. What if what's left is just guilt and an old hotel? Then you make something of the guilt and fix the old hotel." Vera smiled slightly. "My husband died 20 years ago. Worked himself to death on a ranch much like yours probably was. I was angry at him for a long time. Angry he'd chosen the ranch over his health, over time with me. But eventually I realized he'd been doing the only thing he knew how to do. He'd been showing love the only way he understood." Buck felt something tighten in his chest. "Martha died of cancer. I couldn't have changed that." "No. But you could have had different memories. Could have taken those trips. Could have spent more time just being with her instead of always working." Vera paused. "That's not judgment. That's just fact. The question is, what do you do with that knowledge now?" Buck looked at the hotel, the progress he'd made, the work still remaining. "I fix this place, honor Thomas's dream, since he never got to." "And then what?" "I don't know." Vera nodded. "That's an honest answer, at least." She picked up her box. "I brought you pot roast, still warm. Come by the house sometime. You shouldn't always be alone with your thoughts." After she left, Buck ate the pot roast on the porch, watching the light fade. The food was good, better than anything he'd been making for himself. He thought about Vera's question. What do you do with that knowledge now? He didn't have an answer, but at least he was asking the question, which was more than Thomas had done, until it was too late. Buck had avoided the 3rd floor. The damage up there was extensive. Roof leaks had created holes in several rooms, and the floorboards were questionable at best. But a month into his stay, with the ground floor mostly cleared and the 2nd floor habitable, he decided it was time to assess the upper level. He climbed the stairs carefully, testing each step. The 3rd floor hallway was narrower than those below, and the 6 rooms up here were smaller. Servant quarters, probably, back when the hotel had staff. The first 4 rooms were in terrible shape. Water damage had destroyed the floors, and mold covered the walls. Buck marked them as tear-outs. The structure would need significant work before these rooms were usable. The last room on the right was different. It was still damaged, but something about it caught his attention. The door was closed, unlike the others, and when Buck tried the handle, it was locked. He found the lock mechanism simple enough to force with a screwdriver, and the door swung open. The room was smaller than the guest rooms below, with a sloped ceiling that followed the roofline. A narrow bed frame stood against one wall, and a wooden chair sat by the window. The wallpaper was faded and peeling, showing floral patterns that might have been cheerful once. But it was the floor that stopped Buck. In the corner farthest from the door, several boards had come loose, creating a gap about a foot wide. Buck knelt and looked down into the space beneath. Darkness, mostly, but something metallic glinted in the weak light from the window. He retrieved his flashlight from his tool belt and aimed it into the gap. A metal box, the kind people used for important documents, rested on a crossbeam between floors. Buck worked carefully, removing more boards until he could reach the box. It was locked, but the lock was simple and old. He forced it with a screwdriver, and the lid popped open. Inside were papers, not as many as in the safe, but carefully arranged. A letter on top, folded once. Beneath it, a small leather journal. And at the bottom, a photograph Buck hadn't seen before. He sat on the dusty floor and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was different from Thomas's, more flowing, feminine. The paper was cream-colored stationery with an embossed E at the top. The letter was undated, but the paper had yellowed with age. "My dearest Thomas," it began. Buck's heart started beating faster. This was Eliza's handwriting. Eliza's words. "I am writing this in the room where I've stayed these past 3 days, hoping you'll return and find it. I came to Clemency Springs on January 15th, thinking I would find you here, in the hotel you loved more than you loved me, but the hotel is closed. The windows are dark. Your neighbors say you left in December and haven't returned. I came to bring you home, Thomas. I came to tell you that I forgive you for choosing this place, for choosing your pride, for choosing everything except me. I came to say that I understand now. You weren't rejecting me, you were drowning, and you didn't know how to ask for help. I wish I had understood that sooner. I wish I had come in November when you still might have been here. I wish I had told you that the hotel didn't matter, that your pride didn't matter, that only you mattered. I'm leaving this letter in the hope that you'll come back even briefly to collect your things or say goodbye to this place. If you find it, please know I forgive you for staying. I forgive you for the choice you made. But more than that, I hope you'll forgive yourself. Whatever happened here, whatever you lost, it doesn't define you. You're still the man I loved. You're still worthy of happiness and peace. Come find me in Denver if you can. But if you can't, or if you won't, then please, please forgive yourself and build a new life. Don't let this failure destroy you. You're more than this hotel. You always were. All my love, Eliza." Buck read the letter 3 times, his throat tight. Eliza had come. She'd forgiven him. She'd stood in this building, probably walked through the empty rooms and left this message of forgiveness. And Thomas had never known. He picked up the journal. The first entry was dated January 15th, 1930. "Arrived in Clemency Springs this morning. The town is nearly empty. Most of the buildings are already abandoned. The hotel is locked and dark. I knocked on every door and window, but there's no answer. I found a neighbor who told me Thomas left before Christmas. No one knows where he went. January 16, 1930. I broke into the hotel through a window on the east side. Forgive me, Thomas, but I had to see it, had to understand what you chose over us. It's beautiful, even in its abandonment. I can see what you were trying to build. The lobby alone must have been stunning when it was clean and bright. I sat in the check-in area for an hour, trying to imagine you here, greeting guests, proud of what you'd created. I understand now, I think. This wasn't about choosing a building over me. This was about not knowing how to let go of something you'd poured your soul into. I understand that better than I wanted to admit. January 17th, 1930, my last day here. I've left the letter in the 3rd-floor room, where I've been staying. It's the only room that still has a functional lock, so perhaps Thomas will check it if he returns. I've placed it where he can't miss it if he opens the door. I'm going back to Denver. I'll wait for 6 months, hoping he'll find the letter and come find me. But if he doesn't, I'll move forward with my life. I can't wait forever, and I don't think he'd want me to. Thomas, if you're reading this journal along with my letter, I mean what I wrote. You're forgiven. Now forgive yourself." Buck set the journal down and picked up the photograph. It showed Eliza, older than in the other photos. This one must have been taken later, maybe in the 30s. She stood in a garden somewhere, smiling at the camera. She looked peaceful. Happy even, he turned it over. Written on the back, Eliza Morrison Garrett, 1935, Garrett. She'd gotten married, moved on with her life. Buck sat there on the dusty floor as the afternoon light moved across the wall. The tragedy was complete now, but it wasn't the tragedy he'd thought. Thomas and Eliza hadn't ended in bitterness and regret. Eliza had forgiven him. She'd tried to tell him, had come all this way to offer that forgiveness. The tragedy was that Thomas never knew. He'd left carrying his guilt and shame, never knowing that forgiveness was waiting for him. Buck thought about Martha. The things he wished he'd said, the apologies he'd never articulated clearly enough. But Martha had known he loved her, hadn't she? Even when he chose work over vacations, even when he was stubborn about the ranch, she'd known fundamentally that he loved her. He had to believe that. But forgiveness, had he ever asked for it? Had he ever acknowledged out loud that he'd made the wrong choice sometimes? That he should have said yes to those trips, should have spent more time just being with her instead of always working? He stood and walked to the window. The view from up here showed the whole town, such as it was. Empty buildings, empty streets, empty lives. All that remained were the structures, and even those were slowly being reclaimed by time and weather. Buck carefully gathered Eliza's letter and journal. He would keep these with Thomas's letters. The complete story. A story of love and failure and forgiveness, offered but never received. That evening he called Vera. "Can I come by tomorrow? I found something I think you should see." "Of course. Come for lunch." Buck spent that night reading through all the letters again, Thomas's unsent confessions and Eliza's unread forgiveness. Two people who'd loved each other, separated by pride and circumstance and simple bad timing. Thomas left in December. Eliza arrived in January. 1 month, 4 weeks. Such a small gap, and it had changed everything. Before bed, Buck did something he hadn't done since Martha died. He pulled out a notebook and began writing. "Dear Martha," he wrote, "I need to tell you some things I should have said when you were alive." The words came slowly at first, then faster. He wrote for an hour, filling pages with apologies and explanations and admissions of regret. He didn't know if this would help, writing to someone who couldn't read it. But Eliza had written her letter, even though Thomas might never find it. She'd said what needed saying anyway. Maybe that was the point. Maybe forgiveness and apology didn't always need an audience. Maybe sometimes you just had to say the words, release them into the world, and trust that was enough. Buck visited Vera the next afternoon, bringing all the letters and photographs. They sat at her kitchen table, and she read through everything carefully, pausing occasionally to dab at her eyes with a handkerchief. "I never knew the full story," she said when she finished. "Grandmother mentioned Thomas and Eliza, but not like this. Not the details." She held up Eliza's letter. "She came back for him. She forgave him. But he was already gone. Do you know what happened to Thomas after he left?" Buck asked. "No. Grandmother left town in 1933. By then the hotel had been closed for years, and Thomas was long gone." Vera paused. "You know what strikes me most about this?" Eliza moved on. "She got married, had a family, lived a full life. The tragedy didn't define her. The photograph from 1935, she looked happy. She was, from what I heard. Married a good man, had children." Vera smiled sadly. "Sometimes the people who forgive us don't need us to know we're forgiven. They just need to forgive and move forward." Buck stayed for lunch, and they talked about the hotel renovation and the town's history. When he got back to the Fortuna, he decided to tackle the hotel office more seriously. He'd been avoiding it because of the mess. But now he wanted to find every scrap of information about Thomas and Eliza. He spent hours sorting through old papers. Most were business records, invoices and correspondence about hotel operations. But in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, he found a folder labeled Property Records. Inside were deeds, title transfers, and ownership documents. Buck spread them across the old desk and began reading chronologically. Original deed. Thomas Fortuna purchases land and constructs hotel building. February 1926. Standard legal language. Notarized in Denver. Mortgage document. Thomas takes loan from Denver National Bank. March 1926. The amount made Buck wince, $15,000, a fortune in 1926. Foreclosure notice, Denver National Bank seizes property for non-payment. March 1930. Buck's chest tightened reading this. Thomas had been gone by then, so he'd never even seen the official end. Several documents showed the bank holding the property through the Depression years. No buyers, no interest. Just a vacant building in a dead town. Then in 1952, a transfer of ownership. Property sold to Elizabeth Morrison Garrett for sum of $800. Transfer complete June 15th, 1952. Buck stared at the name. Elizabeth Morrison Garrett. Morrison had been Eliza's maiden name. He'd seen it in Thomas's letters. And Garrett was the name from the photograph, the one showing Eliza in 1935. He read the name again, his mind working through the implications. Eliza had bought the hotel. 22 years after leaving that letter for Thomas, after marrying someone else and moving on with her life, she'd bought the hotel. Buck's hands started shaking slightly. He pulled out his phone and called Martha's sister, Sarah. They'd spoken a few times since the funeral, mostly about estate matters and settling Martha's affairs. Sarah, this is going to sound strange, but I need to ask you about Martha's grandmother. On her mother's side, Grandmother Elizabeth? What about her? What was her maiden name? Morrison. Elizabeth Morrison, why? Buck closed his eyes. And her married name? Garrett. She married Harold Garrett in 1930, I think. They had 3 children, including my mother. Sarah paused. Buck, what's this about? What was she called? Did anyone call her Eliza? Yes, actually. Family called her Eliza. Grandmother preferred it, though officially she went by Elizabeth. Sarah's voice changed, became concerned. Buck, are you all right? You're asking very strange questions. I'm fine. Did she ever mention a place called Clemency Springs? Or a man named Thomas Fortuna? The line was quiet for a moment. Oh my God, Buck, where are you right now? I'm at the hotel I bought. In Clemency Springs, Colorado, the Fortuna Hotel. How did you know? Sarah's voice was soft, because Grandmother bought that property in the 50s. She owned it until she died in 1965. Then it passed to my mother, and when Mom died, it went to Martha. Martha owned the Fortuna Hotel, Buck. She owned it for the last 15 years. Buck sat down heavily in the desk chair. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Martha owned this place. She never told you? No, she never mentioned it. Why wouldn't she tell me? I don't know. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Grandmother used to talk about a lost love from before she married Grandfather. Family legend said she'd been engaged to someone who owned a hotel, but it fell through. We always thought it was just a story. Grandmother never gave details. Buck looked at the property deed, at Eliza's name in formal legal script. It wasn't just a story. I found letters, photographs, the whole history. He told Sarah everything, Thomas and Eliza, the failing hotel, the letters Thomas never sent, the forgiveness Eliza offered that Thomas never received. Sarah listened without interrupting. And you just happened to buy this hotel, Sarah said when he finished. Out of all the properties in all the states, you bought this one. I saw it online. It was an impulse. Buck, Martha listed that property for sale 6 months before she died. I remember because she asked me to help her find a real estate agent who specialized in unusual properties. She was very specific about how it should be listed. Photos that showed the decay, but also the potential. Price that was low enough to attract someone looking for a project. Buck felt like he was hearing this from underwater. Why would she do that? I think you know why. He did know. He just didn't want to admit it. Martha had known he'd be lost after she died. She'd known he'd need something, some purpose, some project that could consume him and maybe, eventually, heal him. And she'd given him this, the hotel her grandmother had loved, the place where Eliza had learned about forgiveness and moving forward. She wanted me to find this place, Buck said slowly, to find this story. Martha talked about Grandmother a lot in those last months, Sarah said. About how Grandmother had loved someone and lost him, but found happiness anyway. How she'd learned that forgiveness didn't require the other person to accept it or even know about it. that you could forgive and move on for your own sake. Sarah paused. She said you'd need to learn that lesson. Buck felt something crack open in his chest. Forgive myself. For what, Buck? For not taking those vacations. For choosing work over her. For not, his voice broke, for not being enough. Oh, Buck. Sarah's voice was gentle. You were enough. Martha loved you. She knew you loved her. But she also knew you'd carry guilt after she was gone, and she wanted to give you a way to work through it. Buck looked around the office, at the piles of documents and the water-stained walls and the years of neglect. Martha had given him this place, this story as a gift, a roadmap for his own healing, disguised as a renovation project. I need to go, he said to Sarah. I need to think about this. Call me if you need to talk. And Buck, Martha would be proud of what you're doing with the hotel. She really would. After hanging up, Buck sat in the office for a long time. Then he went to his truck and retrieved the boxes of Martha's belongings he'd brought with him. He hadn't gone through them carefully. It had hurt too much. But now he needed to see what else she might have left for him. In the third box he found it, Martha's journal from her final year. He'd known she kept one, but he'd never read it. That seemed like an invasion of privacy, even after she was gone. Now he opened it carefully and began reading. The early entries were about her illness, her treatments, her hopes for recovery. But as the months progressed, the tone changed. She wrote about her grandmother Eliza, about the story of Thomas and the hotel. She wrote about Buck, about their life together, about the things she wished they'd done differently. One entry, from 8 months before her death, stopped Buck cold. I've been thinking about the Fortuna Hotel. I own it, inherited from grandmother through Mom, but I've never told Buck. It's just been sitting there. This abandoned building full of family history. But lately I've been thinking it might be important. Buck is going to struggle after I'm gone. I know him. He'll sell the ranch because it will hurt too much to stay, and then he'll be adrift. He'll need something to hold on to, some project that gives him purpose while he works through his grief. The hotel could be that. If I list it for sale before I die, if I structure things so he might find it, would that be manipulation? Or would that be giving him the gift grandmother found too late to give Thomas? A place to learn about forgiveness. A place to understand that you can honor the past while building a future. Buck's hands trembled as he turned the page. Martha had planned this, all of it. The listing, the price, the timing. She'd orchestrated his discovery of the hotel the way someone might leave a trail of breadcrumbs for a lost child. He kept reading. An entry from 6 months before her death. I've listed the hotel. Used an agent Buck doesn't know. Priced it low enough that someone looking for a project will bite. I can't control whether Buck finds it, but I can make it available. The rest is up to fate or God or whatever force guides these things. And then, 2 weeks before she died, I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of Buck being alone with his guilt. He thinks I don't know how he regrets choosing work over time together. But I do know. I've always known. I stayed because I loved him, and because the life we built was good, even if it wasn't perfect. I hope he finds the hotel. I hope he finds Thomas's story and Eliza's forgiveness. I hope he learns what grandmother learned, that you can forgive yourself even when the other person isn't there to absolve you. That moving forward isn't betrayal. That building something new doesn't erase what came before. The final entry, written 3 days before she died. Buck, if you're reading this, you found the hotel. Good. Now finish what you started. Fix it up, make it beautiful. And when you're done, when you've poured your grief and guilt into those old walls and brought something dead back to life, maybe you'll understand. You're not fixing the hotel. You're fixing yourself. And that's exactly what I wanted for you. Buck closed the journal and sat in the gathering darkness. Martha had known. She'd understood him better than he'd understood himself. And she'd loved him enough to give him this gift, even knowing she wouldn't be there to see what he made of it. Buck didn't sleep that night. He sat on the porch with Martha's journal, reading passages over and over by lantern light. When dawn came, he was still there, watching the mountains emerge from darkness into grey light, then gold. Gracie wandered over and stood beside him, her warm bulk a comfort. Buck scratched her ears absently. She knew, he said to the donkey. The whole time, Martha knew exactly what she was doing. He thought about the day he'd found the hotel listing online. It had seemed random, a stroke of fate. But Martha had arranged it, made sure the listing would appear in searches, priced it to attract someone looking for exactly what Buck needed. A project big enough to consume him, remote enough to allow grief its space. Over the next several days, Buck worked with a new intensity. He wasn't just fixing an old building anymore. He was completing Martha's plan, honoring her gift. He repaired the roof, replaced windows, tore out damaged walls and rebuilt them. The physical work was grueling for a man his age, but it felt necessary, like penance and praise combined. Vera noticed the change when she visited. "You've got a different energy," she observed. "What happened?" Buck told her about Martha, about the journal, about the connection between Eliza and his wife. Vera listened, nodding slowly. "So this was never random," she said. "No, Martha wanted me to find Thomas's story, to learn what Eliza learned. And have you?" "Learned it, I mean." Buck looked at the hotel, at the progress he'd made. "I'm trying." Eliza forgave Thomas, even though he never knew about it. She moved on, built a good life. Martha wanted me to understand that forgiveness doesn't need the other person's participation. So forgive yourself for not taking those vacations, for being stubborn about the ranch, for being human and imperfect. That's what I'm supposed to do, yes." Buck paused. "It's harder than it sounds. Of course it is. If it was easy, Martha wouldn't have needed to send you on this elaborate journey." Vera smiled. "But you're doing the work." Literally and figuratively, Buck returned to researching Thomas's fate. He'd avoided it before, not wanting to know how the story ended. But now he needed the complete picture. He started with property records, tracking ownership changes. Then he moved to newspaper archives, searching online databases for mentions of Thomas Fortuna. He found nothing in Colorado papers after 1929. Thomas had left no trace when he departed Clemency Springs. Buck expanded his search to Wyoming. That's what Thomas's final letter had suggested, heading west. He searched for Thomas Fortuna and Ranch Hand and various Wyoming towns. It took 3 days of searching before he found it. A death notice in the Cheyenne Tribune, dated April 1942. Thomas James Fortuna, age 46, died April 12th at the Three Rivers Ranch, where he'd worked for the past 12 years. Fortuna, originally from Colorado, had no known family. He will be interred at the county cemetery. Service is private. Buck read the notice multiple times. 46 years old. 12 years working as a ranch hand. No family. The sparseness of it was heartbreaking. Thomas had lived another 12 years after leaving the hotel, working someone else's land, dying alone. But here was the thing Buck kept circling back to. Thomas had rebuilt some kind of life. He'd found work. He'd survived. He hadn't given up completely, even though he'd lost everything. That took courage, even if it was quiet courage, the kind that didn't make for good stories. Buck wondered if Thomas had ever thought about Eliza, if he'd carried her memory through those 12 years. Almost certainly he had. You didn't love someone that deeply and then just forget them. But hopefully Thomas had found some peace, even without knowing he was forgiven. Buck printed the death notice and added it to his collection of documents. The story was complete now. Beginning, middle, and end. Thomas and Eliza had loved each other. Circumstances and pride had separated them. Eliza had forgiven him and moved on. Thomas had died never knowing, but having survived and built what life he could with what remained. That evening, Buck sat at the check-in desk with all the materials spread before him. Letters, photographs, journals, property records, the death notice. He looked at the photograph from opening day. Thomas and Eliza, young and hopeful. Then at the photo of Eliza from 1935, peaceful and content in her garden. Finally at Thomas's death notice, stark and sad. But Eliza's story hadn't ended in tragedy. She'd married, had children, lived until 1965. One of those children had been Martha's mother, which meant Martha existed because Eliza had forgiven and moved forward. And Buck existed in this moment, in this hotel, because Martha had understood the lesson well enough to teach it to him across the barrier of death. The connections were dizzying. 3 generations of love and loss and resilience. Buck was the end point of that line, or maybe just the current point. Since the story would continue in ways he couldn't predict, he thought about Martha's final journal entry. "You're not fixing the hotel. You're fixing yourself," was he. Buck assessed himself honestly. The raw grief had dulled over these months. He could think about Martha now, without that immediate crush of pain. He could remember good moments without feeling like they'd been stolen from him. The guilt was still there. He still wished he'd said yes to those vacations, still regretted choosing work so often. But the guilt no longer felt paralyzing. It felt like something he could live with, something that could coexist with love and good memories. Maybe that was the point. Not to erase guilt or pretend regrets didn't exist, but to acknowledge them and keep moving anyway. That's what Eliza had done. That's what Martha had wanted him to do. Buck made a decision. He would finish restoring the hotel, but not just as a private project. He would open it, make it functional again. Not a museum of tragedy, but a working hotel where people could stay and rest, and maybe find whatever they needed to find. The way he'd found Thomas's story. The next morning, he called a contractor he'd met in town. "I need serious help with this restoration," Buck said. "Electrical, plumbing, structural work. Can you give me an estimate?" The contractor came out that afternoon, walked through the building and whistled low. "This is a massive project. You're talking 6 months minimum, probably closer to a year, and significant money." "I have the money. When can you start?" They worked out a timeline. The contractor would bring in a crew to handle the major systems, electrical, plumbing, HVS. Buck would continue working on the cosmetic restoration himself, room by room. Target opening, spring of next year. Buck called Sarah and told her the plan. "I'm going to open the Fortuna as a working hotel. Honor what Thomas tried to build, what Eliza preserved, what Martha wanted." "That sounds wonderful, Buck. Really wonderful. I need to know more about Eliza's later life. Martha's journal mentioned she was happy, but I want details. Did she ever talk about Thomas?" Sarah thought for a moment. "She did, occasionally. Mom told me that grandmother would sometimes get quiet and distant, and if you asked why, she'd say she was thinking about the man from the hotel, but she always said it fondly, not sadly. Like he was a good memory, not a painful one. She forgave him. She did. And more than that, I think she understood him. Mom said grandmother told her once that loving Thomas had taught her how to love grandfather properly, that understanding someone's flaws and loving them, anyway, was the only kind of love that lasted. Buck thought about that. He'd loved Martha, flaws and all, and she'd loved him the same way. The difference was they'd gotten to stay together, to work through difficulties, to build a life that was imperfect but real. Thomas and Eliza hadn't gotten that chance, but Eliza had taken the lesson anyway and applied it elsewhere. "There's one more thing," Sarah said. "Grandmother left some letters of her own. Mom kept them. They're probably in storage at my place. If you want, I can look for them and send them to you." "Yes, please. I'd like to read them." Buck spent the following weeks in a blur of activity. The contractor's crew arrived and began the major work, rewiring the entire building, installing new plumbing, repairing the roof properly. Buck worked alongside them when he could, learning as he went. In the evenings, he focused on the finishing work, stripping wallpaper, refinishing floors, cleaning the chandelier that hung in the lobby until it sparkled. He created a memorial wall in the lobby. He framed Thomas's opening day photograph, several of his letters, and Eliza's forgiveness letter. He added the newspaper clipping about Thomas's death and the photograph of Eliza from 1935. Above it all, he mounted a brass plaque, "The Fortuna Hotel, 1926, built by Thomas James Fortuna with love and hope, preserved by Elizabeth Morrison Garrett with forgiveness and grace, restored by Buck and Martha Rawlins, in memory of all who seek second chances." The memorial wasn't about tragedy. It was about resilience, about people who'd loved and lost and survived, and in Eliza's case, thrived. About the possibility of moving forward while honoring what came before. Sarah sent Eliza's letters. They were from the 1940s and 50s, written to her daughter, Martha's mother. Buck read them carefully, and they confirmed what he'd hoped. Eliza had been happy. She wrote about her children, her husband, her garden. She wrote about the past, too, but with affection rather than bitterness. One letter from 1952 explained why she'd bought the hotel. "I'm purchasing the old Fortuna Hotel property. Not because I want to restore it, but because I want to ensure it's preserved. Thomas built something beautiful there, and even though it failed, the beauty mattered. I won't let it be completely forgotten." Buck understood that impulse completely. You honor what mattered, even if it didn't last. Especially if it didn't last. By November, 5 months into the restoration, the hotel was transformed. The structure was sound, the systems functional, the rooms clean and furnished with period-appropriate pieces Buck had found at estate sales. He'd worked with a designer to capture the 1920s aesthetic without making it feel like a museum. The result was elegant and comfortable, respectful of history but livable. Buck stood in the completed lobby one evening, looking at the memorial wall, at the chandelier now gleaming above him, at the restored check-in desk. He thought about Thomas standing in this same spot 90-some years ago, proud of what he'd built. Then watching it fail, unable to stop the collapse, but it hadn't ended there. The building had survived. Eliza had preserved it. Martha had kept it. And now Buck had restored it. Not back to what it was, but forward to what it could be. He pulled out his phone and wrote a message to Sarah. "Hotel will open in April. Save the date. I want family there." Then he wrote one more thing in the notebook he'd been using since finding Martha's journal. "Dear Martha, I understand now. Thank you for the gift. Thank you for knowing what I needed before I did. I'll make this place something that honors everyone. Thomas, Eliza, you, and maybe eventually, me too." The Fortuna Hotel reopened on April 15th, 2025, exactly 96 years after Thomas had written his first hidden letter to Eliza. Buck hadn't planned that timing consciously, but when he realized the date's significance, it felt right. A circle closing, or maybe opening again. He stood in the lobby that morning, 67 years old now, wearing a clean shirt and new boots. Gracie stood beside him, wearing a garland of flowers that Vera had insisted on braiding into her mane. The donkey tolerated it with patient dignity. Guests began arriving at noon. Sarah came with her husband and their 2 adult children. Vera brought several people from surrounding areas who remembered Clemency Springs from before it died. A reporter from the regional newspaper showed up, camera in hand. The local historical society sent 3 representatives, excited about the preservation work. Buck greeted everyone at the door, shaking hands, accepting congratulations. It felt strange being the center of attention. He'd lived most of his life as a private man, working a ranch far from anyone's notice. But this felt important enough to overcome his discomfort. The lobby was stunning. The chandelier caught afternoon light and scattered it across the restored tile floor. The check-in desk gleamed with fresh polish. Period furniture, chairs and small tables Buck had collected over months, created seating areas that invited conversation. And on the west wall, the memorial to Thomas and Eliza drew immediate attention. People gathered around it, reading the letters, studying the photographs. Buck heard Sarah explaining to her children, "That's your great-great-grandmother, Eliza. She loved the man who built this hotel, but they couldn't make it work. She forgave him, though. She always said that was the most important lesson she learned." Buck had created programs for the opening, simple cards explaining the hotel's history. He'd written about Thomas and Eliza, about the Depression-era closure, about Eliza buying the property in 1952. He mentioned Martha's connection, but kept it brief. Restored with love by Buck Rawlins in honor of his late wife, Martha, granddaughter of Elizabeth Morrison Garrett. At 2 o'clock, Buck stood by the check-in desk and called for attention. The crowd, maybe 30 people total, quieted and turned toward him. "Thank you all for coming," Buck began. His voice was steady but not loud. People leaned in to hear him. "When I bought this hotel last year, I was running from grief. My wife Martha had died, and I'd sold our ranch because I couldn't bear to stay there without her. I came here looking for silence and found something different. I found a story that mirrored my own regrets. He gestured to the memorial wall. Thomas Fortuna built this hotel with pride and hope. When it failed, he couldn't let go. He chose the building over the woman he loved, and he lost everything as a result. By the time Eliza came to forgive him, he was already gone. He never knew he was forgiven. Buck paused, gathering his thoughts. For most of my marriage, I chose work over time with Martha. They thought I was being responsible, building our future. But I was really just being like Thomas, too proud to see what mattered most. Martha stayed with me anyway. She forgave me without my asking, the way Eliza forgave Thomas. He looked at Sarah, who was wiping her eyes. Martha knew I'd carry guilt after she died. So she left me a gift, this hotel, this story, this place where I could learn what her grandmother Eliza learned, that forgiveness doesn't require the other person's participation, that moving forward honors the past rather than erasing it. Buck's voice grew stronger. This hotel failed in 1930, but it survived. It survived 95 years of neglect and weather and time. And now it's alive again, ready to welcome travelers, ready to be what Thomas dreamed it could be. But more than that, it's a testament to resilience, to second chances, to the possibility that something broken can be restored and made beautiful again. The crowd was completely silent. Buck saw several people openly crying. Thomas never got his second chance, Buck continued. But Eliza did. She forgave and moved forward and built a good life. Martha did the same, staying with a stubborn rancher who didn't always appreciate her enough. And now, standing here in this restored building, I'm trying to learn their lesson, to forgive myself, to build something new while honoring what came before. He gestured around the lobby. This hotel is for anyone who needs what I needed, a place to work through grief, to learn about forgiveness, to find their way forward. It's open to travelers and locals, to families and people traveling alone, to anyone who needs rest and a quiet place to think. Buck reached behind the check-in desk and pulled out an old brass key. There's one room I want to tell you about, the honeymoon suite on the 3rd floor. Thomas had it prepared for Eliza, but they never used it. It's the finest room in the hotel now, restored with every detail right. And I'm making it available for couples, engaged, married, renewing vows, whatever. The first guests have already booked it. He held up the key. This is the original key Thomas had made for that room. It's engraved with their initials, TF and EM. Every couple who stays in that suite will use this key, and they'll be part of the story, part of the ongoing life of this place. A young couple stepped forward. Buck had met them earlier. They were engaged, planning a summer wedding. Buck handed them the key with a smile. Your reservation is for tonight. Congratulations and welcome to the Fortuna Hotel. The crowd applauded. People moved forward to tour the rooms, to see the restoration work, to ask Buck questions. The hotel came alive with voices and footsteps, with the energy of people filling space that had been empty for too long. Buck stood back and watched, feeling Martha's presence in the room as surely as if she stood beside him. He'd completed her plan. He'd learned the lesson. And now, for the first time since her death, he could imagine a future that wasn't just about loss. The guests departed by early evening, leaving Buck alone in the hotel for the first time since the opening. He walked through the room slowly, picking up stray programs, straightening chairs, feeling the weight of accomplishment settle into his bones. The young couple had retreated to the honeymoon suite an hour ago. Buck could hear faint music from the 3rd floor. They'd brought a Bluetooth speaker. The sound of their laughter drifted down the stairwell, and it made Buck smile. New happiness in a place that had known so much sadness. That felt right. Sarah had stayed later than the others, helping clean up. Now she approached Buck with a wooden box he didn't recognize. I brought something I forgot to give you earlier, she said. More of Grandmother Eliza's things. Mom had them in storage, and I thought you'd want to see them now that the hotel is open. Buck took the box and sat at one of the lobby tables. Sarah sat across from him as he opened it. Inside were photographs he hadn't seen before. Eliza with her children in what looked like the 1940s. Eliza and Harold Garrett, her husband at various ages, young, middle-aged, elderly. They looked happy in every photo. Harold was a solid-looking man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. He stood close to Eliza in the pictures, his hand on her shoulder or arm around her waist. "Grandfather was a good man," Sarah said. By all accounts, they had a very happy marriage. Buck found a wedding photograph from June 1930. Eliza wore a simple cream dress, her hair styled in the fashion of the time. She looked peaceful, serene. Not like someone settling for second choice, but like someone who'd made a conscious, happy decision. Harold stood beside her, beaming. Beneath the photographs were letters, Eliza's correspondence with her daughter over the years. Buck had read some of these before, but these were different, more personal, more revealing. One letter from 1962, written when Eliza was in her 50s, caught his attention. "My dear daughter, you asked me once about the man I loved before your father. Thomas was his name. I loved him deeply, but our circumstances didn't allow for that love to flourish. When I came to understand I'd lost him, I grieved. Then I forgave him. Then I moved forward. Meeting your father wasn't settling or giving up. It was choosing life over grief. Harold loved me knowing I'd loved before. He never asked me to pretend Thomas hadn't existed or that my heart had been untouched when we met. He just loved me as I was, scarred and healed and ready to love again, differently, but no less deeply. I want you to understand this. Loving Thomas taught me how to love your father. The heartbreak made me kinder, more patient, more willing to see what mattered. Harold got the best version of me because Thomas had shown me what happened when you don't cherish what you have while you have it." Buck read that passage 3 times. Loving one person had taught Eliza how to love another. The loss hadn't destroyed her capacity for love. It had deepened it. Sarah pointed to another photograph. "This is grandmother in 1965, a few months before she died. She's standing in her garden. Mom said she spent hours there every day, completely content. The photograph showed Eliza as an elderly woman, her hair white, her face lined but peaceful. She stood among roses, smiling at the camera. The smile reached her eyes. This was a woman who'd lived fully, loved deeply, and found peace with her past." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed Buck's hand. "Grandmother never regretted loving Thomas. She never regretted forgiving him, even though he never knew. She said once that forgiveness was the gift you gave yourself, not the other person." After Sarah left, Buck sat in the lobby until well after dark. He thought about Eliza's life, loving Thomas, losing him, forgiving him, marrying Harold, raising children, growing old in peace. She'd lived 45 years after leaving that letter in the hotel. 45 years of love and family and contentment. Buck looked at his own wedding ring. He'd worn it every day since Martha died, unable to take it off. But Martha had left him another ring in a small box with her personal effects. He'd found it months ago, but hadn't been able to bring himself to look at it. Now he retrieved the box from his belongings. Inside was a simple gold band, slightly wider than his wedding ring. A note in Martha's handwriting. "For your next chapter, whenever you're ready." Buck held both rings in his palm. The one that represented his 40 years with Martha. The one that represented whatever came next. They didn't have to be opposing forces. They could coexist, past and future, grief and hope, loss and possibility. He slipped the new ring onto his right hand. It fit perfectly. Then he looked at both hands, the left bearing his marriage to Martha, the right bearing her blessing to move forward. Both rings, both chapters, both parts of who he was now. Buck walked to the memorial wall and stood before the photograph of Thomas and Eliza from opening day. "You never got this chance," he said quietly, "to know you were forgiven, to start over. But I'm getting it because of you, because Martha learned from Eliza, because all of you suffered, so I might understand." He touched the frame gently. "Thank you. All of you. Thank you." From upstairs, he heard the young couple laughing again. New love in the honeymoon suite Thomas had prepared for Eliza. The story continuing, changing, evolving. Not erasing what came before, but building on it, honoring it, learning from it. Buck returned to his room. He'd moved into the manager's quarters on the first floor, a comfortable 2-room space behind the lobby. He lay down in bed and, for the first time in 13 months, felt truly at peace. Martha was gone, but her love remained. His regrets existed, but they no longer defined him. The past mattered, But the future was possible. He fell asleep wearing both rings, hearing the hotel settle around him, alive and full of promise. October arrived with the first snow on the mountain peaks, and the Fortuna Hotel marked 6 months of operation. Buck stood on the porch with his morning coffee, watching the dawn color the sky above Clemency Springs. The air was cool, sharp, carrying the scent of pine from the surrounding hills. The hotel had 12 guests currently, nearly full capacity. A retired couple from Kansas in room 3, a writer from Oregon in room 7, working on a novel and appreciating the quiet. A family of 4 from Texas, taking a scenic drive through the Rockies. And in the honeymoon suite, a pair of newlyweds from Denver, married just last weekend. Buck had settled into a routine. He rose early, made coffee, checked on Gracie, who'd claimed the old carriage house as her personal quarters. He'd walk through the hotel, making sure everything was running smoothly. Then he'd spend time in the lobby, available to guests who wanted to talk or needed recommendations for hiking trails and local attractions. The work suited him. It wasn't physically demanding like ranching had been, but it required constant attention and care. He'd become skilled at managing reservations, handling small repairs, and creating the kind of atmosphere where people felt comfortable staying a while. Vera had been right when she'd warned him about disappearing into the past. For a while he had, but gradually the past had released its grip. He still thought about Thomas and Eliza, still honored their story through the memorial wall, but they'd become companions rather than obsessions. Their story a lesson he'd learned rather than one he was still struggling to understand. Martha was with him constantly, but differently now. Not as an aching absence, but as a warm presence. He'd talk to her sometimes, usually in the evening when the hotel was quiet. He'd tell her about interesting guests, about progress on the property, about small victories and occasional frustrations. He didn't expect answers, but the act of speaking to her brought comfort. The guest book, a new leather-bound volume Buck had commissioned, sat on the check-in desk. He'd asked all guests to leave a comment, and the entries had become one of his favorite parts of running the hotel. People wrote about the peace they'd found here, the history they'd learned, the healing they'd experienced. A woman who'd come in August after her divorce had written, "Found peace here. Thank you for showing me it's possible to honor what was while building what's next." An elderly man who'd lost his son had stayed for 3 days in September. The story of Thomas and Eliza helped me understand something about forgiveness I'd been struggling with. Sometimes you have to forgive yourself for what you couldn't prevent. Buck read these entries regularly, moved by how the hotel had become more than just a place to sleep. It was becoming what he'd hoped, a space for people to work through their own losses and find their way forward. Clemency Springs itself was changing. The hotel's success had attracted attention. An artist had bought one of the empty buildings and converted it into a studio. A retired couple from Montana had purchased the old general store and was slowly restoring it. A writer bought a house at the edge of town, seeking the isolation and quiet. The ghost town was waking up, not to its former glory, but to something new and smaller and perhaps more sustainable. Buck had started writing, documenting everything: Thomas's letters, Eliza's forgiveness, Martha's plan, his own journey. He worked on it in the evenings, slowly building a manuscript that told the complete story. He wasn't sure what he'd do with it when finished. Maybe publish it, maybe just leave it as a record. Either way, it felt important to capture the details before time erased them further. Sarah visited regularly, usually bringing her family. She and Buck had grown closer through this process, bound by Martha's memory and Eliza's legacy. The family connection deepened Buck's sense of place here. He wasn't just running a hotel, he was honoring 4 generations of love and loss and resilience. One afternoon in late October, a man arrived alone, late 50s, wearing the defeated expression Buck recognized from his own mirror 13 months ago. The man checked in quietly, took his key, and headed upstairs without comment. Buck gave him space that first day. But the next morning, when the man came down for breakfast, Buck brought coffee to his table. "First time in Clemency Springs?" Buck asked. Yes, saw the hotel online. Thought it looked quiet. Running from something or towards something? The man looked up, surprised by the directness. Then he smiled slightly. Both, maybe. My wife passed away 6 months ago. I sold our house. Didn't know what else to do. Buck pulled out a chair and sat down. I bought this hotel a year ago for the same reason. Wife died, sold the ranch. Ended up here not knowing why. The man studied Buck's face. Did you figure it out? Why you ended up here? I did eventually. Found a story that taught me what I needed to learn. Buck gestured to the memorial wall. The people who built this hotel, they taught me about forgiveness, about moving forward, about honoring the past without staying trapped in it. They talked for an hour. Buck told Thomas and Eliza's story, explained Martha's connection, described his own journey from grief-stricken widower to hotel owner, finding peace. The man listened, occasionally nodding, his expression shifting from closed to open. You think I'll find something like that here? The man asked. I think if you're looking for it, yes. Sometimes the places that hold the most pain become the ones that teach us how to heal. The man stayed for 5 days. Buck saw him walking the property, sitting on the porch, spending long hours in his room. On his last day, he wrote in the guest book, "Came here broken, leaving with hope. Thank you for creating a space where that's possible." Buck read the entry after the man left and felt something settle deeper in his chest. This was his purpose now. Not just running a hotel, but creating a place where people could do what he'd done, face their grief, learn their lessons, find their way forward. That evening, Buck sat on the porch with Gracie beside him. The mountains were dark silhouettes against the sunset. Lights glowed in a few buildings around town, the artist's studio, the writer's house, the general store slowly coming back to life. Buck thought about where he'd been a year ago. 66, freshly widowed, selling everything he'd built, driving aimlessly through 3 states. He'd bought this hotel on what seemed like impulse, but was actually Martha's careful plan. He'd discovered Thomas's tragedy and Eliza's forgiveness. He'd learned that you could honor the past while building a future. That forgiveness didn't require anyone else's participation. That broken things could be restored and made beautiful again. We did it, Buck said to Martha, to the mountains, to the fading light. We restored this place, and in doing it, I restored myself. A guest emerged from the hotel, a young woman who checked in that afternoon. She walked to the porch railing and looked out at the view. It's beautiful here, she said. Peaceful. It is, Buck agreed. It took almost a century to find this peace, but it was worth the wait. She glanced at him, curious, and Buck smiled. He stood and gestured toward the lobby. Come inside. Let me tell you a story about this hotel, about the people who built it, and about how sometimes staying means moving forward, and sometimes broken things become more beautiful than they ever were whole. They walked inside together, into the warmth and light, into a building that had survived abandonment and decay to become something better than it started, a place of healing, of second chances, of hope. Behind them, Gracie settled onto the porch, and somewhere in the distance, the mountains stood watch over a ghost town learning how to live again.